My name is Nina Flores. I am 32 years old. The night everything finally snapped, I was sitting at my parents' dining table in El Paso, Texas, staring at a pan of enchiladas while my mom raised her glass and cheerfully announced that my older sister Lucia finally had a clean slate because, in her words, we used your print shop to clear her mess and keep this family together. A few hours earlier, I had watched strangers wheel my printing presses into a box truck, but hearing my parents turn that into a feel-good dinner speech did something different to me. Lucia sat across from me swirling her margarita with a little smirk, as if my business being gutted was just the universe finally putting us on the same level. I did not scream or throw anything. I slid a thick binder onto the table between the salsa and the tortillas and told them calmly that what they were bragging about was not a sacrifice or a favor. It was fraud. Before I walk you through how we got to that table and what happened after, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done if your parents announced they had sold your business to erase your sister's debt. My dad kept eating like he was too busy for drama, but his jaw tightened every time I said the word illegal, and my mom gave me that tight smile she used whenever I refused to play the grateful child. Lucia did not even pretend to feel guilty. She just shrugged and said it was only equipment, and that I was lucky we had something to trade, like my entire shop was a yard sale pile. They had expected me to show up already defeated from seeing the truck at Flores Inc., maybe begging to know how I could help them make the payments. Instead, I opened the binder to the operating agreement for my company and turned it so the signature page faced them, the clauses highlighted where it said that no one could sell or pledge anything without my notarized consent. I told them every page in that binder was a fuse, and that once I put copies in the right hands, the sweet little story they were telling themselves about family sacrifice would burn down fast. The only reason we were even having this dinner was because of everything that had come before, all the years where I was expected to carry more quietly and smile while I did it. I did not wake up one day and choose to be the responsible one. In our neighborhood on the east side of El Paso, in a small stucco house that always smelled like beans and cleaning spray, my role was assigned early. I was the younger daughter who remembered permission slips and set my own alarm so no one had to wake me. Lucia, 2 years older, was the star of family conversations no matter how little actually stuck in her life. When I brought home straight A's, my parents nodded and said that was what we expected from you, then moved on. When Lucia scraped by with a barely passing grade, we had long talks at the table about how she was so creative and how school just did not understand people like her. If I forgot to take out the trash, there was a lecture about responsibility and how I embarrassed the family. If Lucia left the kitchen looking like a tornado had passed through, my mom sighed about her artistic temperament and asked me to help, because as she put it, I was better at chores anyway. You learn pretty fast that effort only counts when it comes from one side. The first place I ever felt like my reliability meant something was my great-aunt's shop. My dad's aunt Rosalinda Vega owned a tiny screen printing place, wedged between a pawn shop and a taqueria near downtown. The front windows were always dusty, the back room was always too warm from the dryers, and the whole place smelled like ink and cardboard. To me, it felt like a studio and a refuge. When I was 12, my parents started sending me there after school to help out, which really meant to give them a break from driving Lucia to practices and auditions. My great-aunt showed me how to line up a design on a t-shirt, how to clean a screen without tearing the mesh, and how to write down every order so nothing got lost. She did not roll her eyes when I double-checked things. She asked my opinion on colors, trusted me to tally invoices, and when I looked tired, she told me to sit in the back with a cold soda for 10 minutes instead of handing me more tasks. It was the first place in my life where doing things right was treated like value, not wallpaper. As her diabetes got worse and appointments multiplied, I became more than free labor. I was the one who rode the bus with her to the clinic, who translated doctor talk into plain Spanish and English. She actually understood who argued with pharmacy staff when they tried to swap her prescriptions for cheaper versions that made her sick. At first, my parents came along, but as Lucia's schedule filled with auditions and networking dinners, those hospital trips quietly became mine. Lucia would show up on holidays with a cute mug and a selfie, then disappear. No one announced that I had become the primary caregiver. Everyone just behaved like it was obvious. When my great aunt finally passed my parents and I went to a lawyer's office off Mesa Street to support my dad while he handled her affairs, I assumed I was there to help explain paperwork. Instead, the attorney read out that Flores Inc., the building, the equipment, the business was being left to me personally. Not to my parents, not to my sister and me together, just to Nina Flores. My mom's smile froze. My dad stared at the wall, and Lucia suddenly became fascinated with a crack in the carpet. Nobody objected, but the quiet in that room said plenty. After the funeral, my parents started referring to the shop as our little family business, telling relatives that we now had a print place and that we would all be more comfortable once it really got going. At home, my mom would say things like, "When your shop takes off, we can finally fix this house." And my dad liked to remind me that if anything big ever happens, we can always lean on the business, that we always had more mouths in it than hands. Flores Inc., in reality, was a tired building with old equipment, a handful of loyal clients, and a lot of deferred maintenance. I took a full-time job as a graphic designer for a medical supplier, so I could afford to keep the shop open in the evenings. Weekends were spent ripping out moldy shelving, repainting walls, and learning to repair machines from online videos. I took tiny orders for local soccer teams and school events, anything to keep money coming in. The shop was not some cute side project. It was my path to something that did not depend on whether my parents were in a good mood or whether Lucia finally landed a big break. The more I invested in Flores Inc., the more nervous I became about how casually my family talked about it. I had seen my parents treat my time, my paychecks, and even my car as backup plans for whatever went wrong with Lucia. I did not want to watch them do the same thing to my business. So I took my fear and my stack of invoices to someone who actually understood contracts. Isabel Cruz and I had sat next to each other in freshman English at Eastwood High. Years later, she was back in El Paso as an attorney focused on small businesses. I met her at a coffee shop near UTEP and laid everything out the way my parents talked about our shop, the way they floated ideas about using what we have whenever Lucia struggled, the way I trusted written terms with strangers more than promises from my own family. Isabel did not tell me I was ungrateful. She walked me through forming an LLC, drafting an operating agreement, and writing clear language that said Flores Inc. LLC was owned and managed solely by me, and that no loan sale or lien involving company assets could happen without my notarized signature. Filing those documents felt like putting a steel door on something I had been guarding with my bare hands. Isabel made sure the operating agreement was attached to my bank records. We filed everything with the state, and I bought a small fireproof safe for my apartment to store the originals. When my parents found out, they acted like I had personally insulted them. My mom accused me of making things complicated and asked if I did not trust them after everything we've sacrificed. My dad grumbled that family should be enough, and that lawyers only caused trouble. I told them it was just how real businesses worked, that it was about taxes and liability. The truth was simpler and uglier. I did not trust them to protect what I was building when Lucia needed rescuing again. Letting them underestimate how serious the documents were felt safer than trying to compress a decade of resentment into one honest conversation. Walking out of Isabel's office that day, I allowed myself to believe that clear paperwork would be enough to keep anyone, family included, from gambling my shop without my consent. While Flores Inc. slowly became stable, Lucia's life went the other direction in slow motion. She cycled through identities, photographer, lifestyle, blogger, social media strategist, then mindset coach, each one launched with a flurry of Instagram posts and expensive gear. Income never kept up with the image, but she always had a story about a big client or brand deal that was about to hit. Credit filled the gap between the life she wanted and the one she could actually afford. There were credit cards for business expenses, personal loans to cover investments in herself, and unpaid taxes she insisted were no big deal. My parents co-signed on a car lease because clients expect a certain look, floated her rent when she fell behind, and refinanced their own house to consolidate some of her balances. One night, sitting at my kitchen table with Callie, my roommate and part-time bookkeeper for the shop, I added everything up: the revolving balances, the private loans, the back rent disguised as slow months. The total hanging over Lucia sat somewhere around $240,000. It was not one mistake. It was years of choices where wanting something was treated as justification for borrowing more. For a while, I did what everyone assumed I would do. When a landlord threatened eviction, I covered a month just this once. When a credit card was about to be sent to collections, I sent enough to calm it down, and told myself I was protecting my parents' credit. None of that money ever came back. Each time I stepped in, it got easier for everyone else to see my bank account and my business as extra safety nets. The turning point came when my mom called me sobbing, saying Lucia's debt was crushing her, and that if we did not find a way to consolidate soon, her life would be over. My dad got on the line and suggested carefully that I could borrow against the equipment at Flores Inc., because it is just sitting there anyway, and your great aunt would want it used to save family. I heard the shape of the trap clearly. The shop was not a toy. It was the difference between me, barely scraping by, and having any sort of margin. Agreeing to pledge it for Lucia's chaos would mean turning my one steady asset into a ticking bomb. I told them I would not use Flores Inc. as collateral for anyone. The silence on the other end of the line felt like the moment before a car crash. The fallout was immediate and loud. My mom accused me of abandoning my sister and said no decent person would watch family drown while sitting on a lifeboat. My dad sent long texts about how blood comes before paperwork and how my great aunt didn't raise you to be selfish. Lucia called and left voice messages about how I was obsessed with money and how if I truly believed in her, I would invest in her comeback. I stuck to my no, but it did not feel heroic. It felt like holding onto a door while people you loved slammed themselves against it. At work, I leaned hard on the two people who actually wanted me to keep what I had built. Gabriel, my press operator and unofficial production manager, reminded me that Flores Inc. paid real bills for real people, including him. Callie ran numbers with me at our kitchen table until I could see it clearly. If I let the business be leveraged for Lucia's debt, I would be volunteering to go down with a ship I had not even boarded. The months after that fight were tense in an almost quiet way. My parents stopped asking outright, but they started dropping more pointed comments about using what we have and not letting an asset sit idle when your sister is drowning. Lucia's social media posts shifted fewer debt complaints, more shots of her at brunch again, which made me suspicious. She had clearly plugged at least some of the holes, but nobody would say how. Meanwhile, I was worn out. I was working full-time at the medical supplier, running the shop evenings and weekends and enduring constant emotional crossfire at home. When Callie found a flyer for a design and small business conference in Phoenix and suggested I go for a long weekend, my first instinct was to say I could not leave. Gabriel pushed back. He told me he could handle the smaller orders, reschedule anything complicated, and that if I kept grinding without a break, I would burn out and lose the shop anyway. After a lot of hesitation, I booked a cheap hotel, bought a bus ticket, and told my parents I would be gone from Friday to Monday. They did not argue about the trip, which should have been my first sign that something was off. My mom just said, "Maybe some time away will help you see the bigger picture," and my dad muttered that he hoped I would come back ready to be part of the solution. Before I left, I walked Gabriel through every open order and locked the original operating agreement and other key documents back in the safe in my office. I left Callie with online access so she could pay vendors if anything came due. On the bus to Phoenix, I changed my phone settings so only calls from a tiny emergency list Isabel, Gabriel, and Callie could break through. For 2 days, my world shrank to conference rooms, panel discussions about scaling small businesses, and late night conversations with other owners about boundaries and burnout. I heard the phrase, protect your signature like you protect your front door, at least 3 times. I remember thinking how glad I was that my parents did not have any legal way to touch Flores Inc., even if they hated my boundaries. What I did not know then was that my parents had already crossed the line I was so proud of drawing. A few months earlier, after my firm refusal, Lucia had introduced them to one of her coaching contacts, who put them in touch with a man named Damian Ross. He specialized in fast, high-interest loans for people with assets but bad credit. They met him at a cafe not far from Isabel's office. My parents described Flores Inc. as a family business run by their overworked daughter who hated paperwork and had put everything into an LLC for convenience. Damien asked who had authority to sign. Instead of saying our younger daughter who already said no, my parents handed over a power of attorney document that claimed to give my mom the right to act on my behalf for business matters. My name was on it in handwriting that looked enough like mine to pass a quick glance, and our neighbor who worked as a notary had stamped it despite me never being present. Damien's team treated that document as valid. The loan they arranged was for a little over $200,000 secured by a blanket line over Flores Inc.'s equipment inventory and receivables. The money hit my parents' account soon after. From their perspective, they had finally done what needed to be done. They cleared Lucia's worst credit cards, brought her car lease current, caught up on past due rent, and quietly paid off a chunk of their own credit so their scores would not sync with hers. For a few months, things probably felt easier in their world. Lucia went back to posting about new beginnings and energy shifts, and my parents stopped talking about doom. But Damien's payments were steep, and my parents' incomes had not magically grown. They made the first installment, maybe the second, then started falling behind. Damien's company sent letters and scheduled a repossession to enforce their lien. According to paperwork I saw later, my parents mentioned that I would be out of town for a few days and that the shop would be easier to access then. So while I was in Phoenix listening to strangers talk about boundaries, Damien's crew was lining up a truck behind Flores Inc. The first hint that something worse than usual had happened came when the bus rolled back into El Paso, and I switched my phone off emergency mode. The blank screen lit up with missed calls and messages from my mom, my dad, and Lucia. Some were a few weeks old, full of big news about how they had finally found a way to get ahead, and how the shop is finally pulling its weight for the family. The newer ones were panicked messages about a misunderstanding with a lender about temporary repossession, about how we all need to stay calm. There were no calls from Isabel Gabriel or Callie, which meant no one on my emergency list had been able to reach me or thought it would help to try. Instead of firing off angry texts at my family, I texted Isabel and asked her, in the most neutral words I could find, to check state records for any filings naming Flores Inc. while I had been away, and to call me back. Then I drove straight to the shop. When I pulled into the alley behind the strip of storefronts, the box truck was already there, ramp-down men in work gloves, moving my equipment like it was office furniture. Through the open bay door, I could see my 4-color press half-loaded exposure unit, wrapped in plastic, and shelves of ink boxed up. Inside, a man with a clipboard introduced himself as a representative for Damien's company, and politely explained that they were enforcing a lien because the borrowers were behind on their payments. When I told him I was the sole owner of Flores Inc. and had never signed any loan documents, he flipped through his folder and produced a copy of the power of attorney with my name at the bottom. It was dated months earlier, on a day I knew I had been at the shop all afternoon. The signature looked close, but I knew every loop and slant of my own handwriting. That was not mine. Gabriel rushed in halfway through the chaos, having gotten a vague call from my dad telling him not to panic. The crew allowed us to pull out customer records and personal items, but kept loading anything considered collateral. Standing in the middle of that half-emptied shop, I realized this was not just about my family making a bad call. My name was attached to a lie that had now been used to strip my business. That is how I ended up at my parents' house that night with a binder instead of an apology. They had invited me over for a nice family dinner to talk everything through, which meant they wanted to pitch me their version before anyone else's took root. My mom set the table like it was a holiday, serving enchiladas and rice and pouring margaritas, while she talked about how heavy the last year had been and how no parent wants to do what we had to do. My dad launched into a speech about how the loan was only temporary and how once Lucia's coaching business really takes off, everyone would come out ahead. Lucia chimed in about how free she finally felt now that her debt energy was gone and how she could finally focus on growth. When I opened the binder and laid the Flores Inc. operating agreement in front of them with the clause highlighted that said, "No loan or sale could happen without my notarized signature," my dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. I told them that the power of attorney my mom had waved at Damien was a forgery and that the notary stamp on it was fraudulent. I also told them that I had already involved a lawyer. They tried to sell me on their motives. My mom said the shop only existed because of this family, and that my great aunt would have wanted it used to keep us together. My dad claimed they had not really stolen anything because they fully intended to pay the loan back, and that I was being harsh calling it fraud, when it was really a misunderstanding. Lucia rolled her eyes and said no prosecutor was going to throw a sweet old couple in jail over a little paperwork, like the law was a suggestion if you cried enough. I told them prosecutors cared about date signatures and lies, told to lenders not about who brought what to Thanksgiving. I added that from that moment on, I would not be speaking privately to any of them about the situation. Everything would go through Isabel. My mom's face crumpled into wounded disbelief, the look she used when she wanted me to feel like I was breaking her heart just by standing up for myself. I pushed my chair back, left the binder on the table, and walked out. No dramatic screaming, no slammed doors, just the sound of my keys in my hand, and my dad saying my name in a voice that had lost its authority. The next stretch of time was tedious and brutal in a different way. Isabel turned my outrage into organized facts. We met in her cramped office surrounded by cardboard boxes of other clients' files and lined up every document associated with Flores Inc. The LLC paperwork bank records the operating agreement, emails, and copies of the forged power of attorney and Damien's loan. Isabel drafted letters to Damien's legal department summarizing the situation and enclosing proof that I had never authorized any loan. She filed a complaint against the neighbor notary with the state agency that oversees commissions, including a sworn statement from me that I had never appeared before her on the date listed. She contacted the county attorney's office about potential charges for forgery and securing execution of a document by deception. She also reached out to the Texas Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division because Damien's company had recorded a lien based on questionable paperwork. Every piece of this was aimed at one simple goal: remove the lien from my business and make it clear that my parents' signatures, not mine, were the ones that should carry consequences. Once Damien's company understood what they were holding, their tone flipped from firm to cautious. Their lawyers compared my real signatures on incorporation documents and old contracts to the one on the power of attorney and saw that they did not match. They could see that the operating agreement, which limited who could bind the company, had been in place long before the POA appeared. They interviewed their own staff about what my parents had said in that first meeting, and it became obvious they had been told a story about a daughter who was too busy for paperwork but on board. Damien's company had a problem. They had advanced over $200,000 based on collateral they might not legally control. To protect themselves, they cooperated. The repossession was put on hold, then reversed. Equipment that had not been resold was returned to the shop. What could not be returned became part of the restitution calculations. Damien's legal team provided information to law enforcement about the forged POA and my parents' representations. A detective from the county attorney's office interviewed me, Isabel, at my side about my relationship with Flores Inc., my trip to Phoenix, and whether I had ever authorized my mom to sign on my behalf. Saying out loud that my parents had lied in my name to get money felt like swallowing glass. In the end, this did not turn into some televised trial, but it was still public and real. The county filed charges against my parents for forgery and for securing execution of a document by deception. Their attorney tried to argue that they had not meant harm and that they had always planned to repay the loan. The evidence did not care about intentions. It cared about signatures dates and outcomes. They negotiated a plea deal to avoid jail time. As part of it, they pled guilty to reduced counts, received several years of probation, and were ordered to attend financial counseling. Most significantly, they were saddled with a restitution schedule requiring them to repay Damien's company for the remaining balance of the loan. The neighbor notary had her commission revoked and faced penalties for notarizing a document without the signer present. The lien on Flores Inc. was formally released in writing, and a signed agreement confirmed that I had no responsibility for any of the loan. My equipment came back scraped and slightly damaged but still workable. Gabriel and I spent evenings recalibrating the presses and reassuring clients that we were not closing our doors. Lucia did not come out of this untouched. Once the loan was unwound and the money had to be paid back, the illusion that she had been rescued disappeared. The credit card companies she had been juggling for years went back to calling when the payments stopped. The landlord, who had once been quietly assured by my parents that things would be handled, became less patient when no one could float her anymore. My parents, now paying restitution and dealing with probation, could not take on her balances, and their own credit was dented enough that new loans were not an option. Lucia tried to pivot online again, posting about rebuilding from nothing and turning rock bottom into a comeback story, but lenders and landlords care more about history than hashtags. Eventually, she filed for personal bankruptcy. The downtown loft she had used as a backdrop for her brand ended. The leased car went back. She moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town with a roommate she barely liked and took a job hosting at a chain restaurant off the interstate. She blocked me on social media long before I saw any of that firsthand. I heard most of it through people who still floated between our worlds and could not understand why I was not writing in to fix things. The emotional noise after the legal part wrapped up was loud in a different way. Extended relatives who only got the watered-down version called to tell me my parents were heartbroken and that I needed to be the bigger person. A cousin messaged me to say she had seen my mom crying at church and asking people to pray that her girls would reconcile. Old family friends hinted that everyone makes mistakes and that I should not throw away blood over money. I gave them all the same answer: I was not discussing it, and if they had questions, they could read the court records. At Flores Inc., Gabriel and Callie became more than co-workers. They were my buffer and my chosen family. We focused on steady, unflashy work uniforms for local schools, shirts for youth teams, merch for small bands. I added a little retail section with designs that meant something to me: West Texas imagery, bilingual phrases about boundaries and self-respect. Every morning when I unlocked the door and saw my presses still there, I remembered how close I had come to losing everything because people who claimed to love me thought my work existed to pay for my sister's choices. Now, a while later, my life is not glamorous, but it is mine. Flores Inc. pays my rent, covers my employees, and lets me sleep at night without rehearsing emergency budgets in my head. I no longer answer calls or texts from my parents or from Lucia because they do not have my new number and they are blocked everywhere else. I do not go to holiday dinners. I do not send birthday cards. When news about them filters through someone who has not learned to keep my name out of it, I let it pass through me and keep moving. The little girl who cleared plates and fixed problems quietly is retired. In her place is a woman who understands that being the younger daughter does not mean being the family's safety net. Being dependable does not make you disposable. My parents decided that my business and my future were acceptable collateral for Lucia's mistakes and dressed it up as love. Lucia decided that as long as someone else could pay, she did not have to change. They all counted on me caring more about being seen as a good daughter than about protecting myself. They miscalculated. I kept my shop, my autonomy, and my boundaries. They kept their version of the story, but they lost the right to use my name, my credit, or my work to fund it. I can understand how they justified it to themselves without forgiving any of it. I will not give them another chance to prove they value my sister's comfort more than my safety. If any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, hear me clearly. You are allowed to say no before the loan papers are signed, before the presses are loaded, before they turn your life into their emergency fund. You are allowed to close the door and lock it. Thank you for listening, and tell me in the comments if you were sitting at that dinner table in El Paso and your parents casually announced they had sold your business to erase your sister's debt. What would you have done?